in the lodge dining room overhearing.
Old farts. Goodness, Captain. At 94, aren't you the oldest fart at Heritage Pines?
Depends on what you consider old farts, I reckon. Some at Heritage Pines retirement home were old farts when they were 50.
I see, but it sounds like you have good news?
Nothing grand, but progress. Other news may interest you more. Sam Steele is flying his Cub over at 2 this afternoon to begin your flight training. Since you are both more experienced in Cubs and Champs, your first lessons will be in Sam's Cub. Sam is charging you $85 for travel expenses each trip and $100 an hour for instruction in his Cub. It's been a while since Sam has flown as a Mango, so I will go around the patch with him for a few landings before he flies it with you. Sam's Zamango lessons will be $50 an hour. Pretty reasonable these days, I'd say. After you solo the Zamango, you'll be able to fly over to his strip for instruction and save the travel fees. We'll be late for dinner at the lodge, so plan on dinner at the food barn near the airport. Sam won't be joining us. We should leave here at noon and have the Zamango ready to go before Sam arrives. Meanwhile, we can spend a couple of hours with the book after breakfast.
Sounds great, Captain. Good day for it, too. I'll tell Georgie we'll be away to the airport past dinner.
After breakfast at their regular spot on the edge of the woods.
So, tell me your news, Captain. Did you have a flying dream?
Not exactly, but there's progress to report. I've been working at limbering up my neck to roll my head on my pillow. I'm getting through the neck pains better, and I've begun to regain the kind of self-hypnosis I did as a 4-year-old, trying to get past my earaches and put myself asleep, which led to controlling my dreams of levitation. Well, not really dreams, since I remain semi-conscious. Flights of fancy, I suppose you could call them, or out-of-body experiences.
How much progress have you made?
So far, it's as I began 90 years ago. I saw myself curled up in a fetal position, looking back down at me from the far corner of the ceiling of a large room.
That's great. Anything else?
No, that's it. It didn't last long, just a few seconds.
Do you recall what the next steps were at age 4 as your flights progressed?
Oh yes, the experience gradually lasted longer. Then I shifted to being on the shelf in the corner of the ceiling, looking back down at myself on the bed.
What did you do? Was there any sound or motion? What did the room look like? Where was it?
No sound or motion. I remained still and in a fetal position, floating without support. The room was dimly lit and featureless. No doors, windows, pictures, light fixtures, or furnishings. Nowhere I had been before.
How did you feel? Were you frightened?
It was very peaceful and calm, and my ear aches left. I think I was reassured by seeing myself on the bed, looking back up at me without alarm or fear. When you're 4, the whole world is so new and full of wonders, it's easy to accept such events as common experiences. So the dreams eventually progressed to flying freely, but required so much focused concentration that success was spotty and short-lived. Many times I failed altogether. Although I knew it wasn't real, I believed that it could be one day.
Well, Captain, you were certainly right about that. I've seen you actually levitate, albeit you were asleep and didn't realize it. You didn't seem surprised when I told you. Why was that?
Partly because at my age, the surprise threshold is quite high, Mike. Besides, the dreams are so vivid, and I've had so many of them over the years, that I felt the experience was very close to reality. So when you said you saw me levitate, it was not a great leap of faith for me. Mostly I felt nostalgia. When you have wanted to accomplish something so strongly for so many years and finally get there, you realize that it was the adventure of the journey that mattered more than the destination itself. I felt the same when I earned my Navy wings, and especially when I sighted the Cape St. Vincent lighthouse arriving in Europe after sailing wings across the Atlantic in '86. Important phases of my life had ended and could not be repeated. Buddhists say that death is life's greatest adventure, and it may be. Meanwhile, I think the getting there is the best part. It was the same with sex and love, too. What do you think, Mike?
I haven't thought about it much, but I see your view. I can relate it to earning my law degree. Graduation and passing the bar didn't seem like big events after the effort that went into the achievements. Landmark ceremonies which come at the end of adventures remind me of your thoughts about the Wizard of Oz's awards. I agree that sex itself is overrated. Of course, it's easy for us to say that at our age, but the best part of it was the romance and intimacy. And who knows what love really is? Women, especially mothers, think they have an exclusive understanding, and men just don't get it. But I think much of women's notion of love is self-satisfaction derived from manipulating men and children. That's why so many women are nurses and teachers, captive audiences.
Right, Mike. On the other hand, men love to do fun things with machines and organizations which become extensions of themselves.
Like sailing and flying, Captain.
Exactly, Mike, or being a commanding officer, which brings us back to passing through. We left off in December 1956. I had just gotten my naval aviator wings, and 6 of us in my class received orders to VAH-6 at Naval Air Station North Island. We had never heard of a VAH squadron. We knew that V meant heavier than air, so we weren't going to a blimp squadron. We also knew that A meant an attack squadron, so that wasn't bad because some had jets. But the H was a mystery. The administrative yeoman could only suggest helicopters. Good grief, helicopters? Then we asked our bachelor instructor. He didn't know what H meant either, but said he would fly anything to be stationed at North Island, because Coronado's Mexican Village Bar and Restaurant was naval aviation's most famous body exchange. Finally, someone told us about the Directory of Navy Squadrons, where we found VAH-6 listed as Heavy Attack Squadron 6, assigned 24 AJ-2 Savage aircraft. So what was heavy attack, and what were AJs, we asked? Who knew? Finally, someone told us AJs were carrier-based bombers with 2 props and a jet, designed to deliver nuclear weapons. Our hearts sank. We had extended obligated service for a year to be jet fighter pilots. Now we were going to be multi-engine prop bomber pilots? Good Lord, what a letdown. Then someone told us that AJs were being replaced with new twin-jet A3D Sky Warriors. Hey, not so bad after all. We were going to fly the latest jets in the fleet. So with high hopes, we set off for San Diego. I'll digress here to tell about North Island, on the west side of San Diego Harbor. San Diego was home port to a major portion of Navy's Pacific Fleet, carrier squadrons, and seaplanes. As many as 4 carriers were home ported at Naval Air Station North Island, with the pretty little town of Coronado attached. Besides the Mexican Village, Coronado was best known for the Hotel del Coronado, a huge, posh, beautiful hotel built in the 20s, affordable only to the rich and famous. There was no connecting bridge across the harbor. Other than driving 30-plus miles around South Bay, auto ferries, or nickel snatcher passenger launches were the only way to get to North Island. Although Coronado residents were happy to be isolated from the San Diego riffraff, the nickel snatchers were a hell of an inconvenience and bottleneck for the thousands of sailors and civilian workers commuting daily to the base. Finally, in the 60s, despite very strong resistance by Coronado, a major bridge replaced water transport across the harbor.
Coronado sounds exclusive. Were you able to afford to live there, or did you ride the nickel snatchers too?
We were very fortunate to find a nice, affordable two-bedroom apartment on the ground floor, just a few blocks from the base. Looking back now, I can't imagine how we managed our finances. But we settled in quickly and comfortably, despite the fact that David was only 5 months old and Orly was 5 months along with Christopher.
Fast start, Captain. Did it go as well for you at the squadron?
Unfortunately, no. It was a depressing evolution from the first day we drove onto the squadron parking lot. It was a Sunday afternoon. Orly, David, and I drove around the base to check out the locations of facilities and the squadron area. Our impression was that NAS, North Island, was a very old and cluttered major Navy seaport industrial site. Every square foot of it, without huge warehouses, aircraft overhaul facilities, and machine shops, was paved over with roads, parking areas, or runways. It seemed to be more a ship's facility than an air base. Naturally, Navy was very hardware-oriented by virtue of operating subs, ships, and airplanes based at large seaport cities. There was little room at such bases, nor funds in the Navy budget to accommodate dependence facilities or housing. With many husbands deployed to sea at any given time, there was little cohesion among Navy wives, unlike the other services where many bases are remotely located with housing and facilities on base. So, Navy wives were independently on their own, with little reason to feel attachment to the Navy or their husbands' jobs. Consequently, family separation was the primary cause of low career retention and the high divorce rate. Eventually, we located aircraft hangars and a Hatron 6 sign and logo. Immediately on turning into the parking lot, we were greeted by a guard shouting, "Halt!" and leveling the muzzle of an automatic weapon into my face through my open passenger window, though there were no gates or signs to indicate it was a restricted area. "Welcome to the fleet." Strangely, when I reported to the squadron the next day, there were no armed guards, restrictions, or apparent security of any kind. Nor were there any signs of welcome as I checked in. The duty officer barely looked up, and the admin chief simply handed me a list of offices to check in with. So it was everywhere I went. No welcome aboard, no handshakes, no introductions, no offers of help. The morale in this squadron had to be the lowest in the fleet. It didn't take long to find out why. VA-86, the only heavy attack squadron on the West Coast, was an unusually large squadron, at least 3 times the size of other carrier squadrons, with 23 AJ-2s assigned and over 90 flight crews, plus 20 ground officers and over 600 enlisted men assigned to the aircraft maintenance department. Every pilot came from multi-engine patrol plane backgrounds. Many were ex-seaplane pilots. None of them had less than 5,000 flying hours, compared to our 300 hours. None of them had carrier experience before coming to AJs, so they had little motivation to land airplanes larger than Doolittle's B-25s onto small World War II flight decks, especially at night. The AJ had no co-pilot. The right side had no flight controls. It was occupied by the Bombardier Navigator, a 250-pound bomb sight computer, radar scope, and optical bomb sight. The Bombardier Navigators, BNs, were all junior officers with reserve commissions. Several BNs were naval aviators who had completed multi-engine flight training and had made 1 or 2 deployments as BNs, but never graduated to flying in the left seat as heavy attack aircraft commanders because they didn't accumulate the required minimum 1,200 hours flight time before they were due for release from active duty, which they all eagerly look forward to at the earliest opportunity. The third seat of the AJ, behind the pilot, facing aft, was occupied by an enlisted third crewman, who actually did not have a job in the airplane. Each deploying attack carrier had a 3-plane AJ detachment and 4 3-man air crews, so there were many men in the squadron coming and going who never met. We soon learned that the A3D Sky Warrior was several years away from fleet introduction, and that the 6 of us were to be trained and deployed as BNs, like the junior aviators before us. To say that this did not sit well with us would be a gross understatement. The most vocal among us, Jack, wrote his senator and congressman, charging Navy with breach of contract because we had extended obligated active duty to be jet pilots, not bombardiers. A congressional investigation followed, which made all of us very unpopular in the squadron. PL, political influence bypassing the chain of command, was unacceptable in military service. In the heated exchange with Captain Charles, the Hatwing commander, Jack called the captain a son of a bitch, which he certainly deserved, only earned Jack court-martial charges, which were dropped after Jack's second letter to his congressman.
Were there any positive results of the congressional investigation?
None. Navy successfully defended itself with the old standby needs of the service excuse, plus the technical catch-22 that we had extended for jet pilot training only, with no guarantee of assignment to jet squadrons. As Navy recruiters are often quoted, if you can't take a joke, you shouldn't have joined up. To make matters worse, my collateral duty assignment was assistant maintenance officer, which my BA degree in psychology did not qualify me for. My boss, Commander Jack Bolton, the maintenance officer, was a one-man show jerk who had virtually nothing to do with me. The AJ was a highly complex airplane and a maintenance nightmare. The squadron's aircraft flight readiness status was often under 10%. Reliability was so bad that crews routinely did not bother strapping into their seats until the takeoff checklist was complete at the end of the runway, because chances were that grounding discrepancies would result in taxiing back to the line without flying. The files of thousands of maintenance instructions on the office shelves were so way over my head that I escaped by hanging out with the chiefs and petty officers in the line shack, passing the time of day picking up pearls of wisdom like, the good thing about being married in the Navy is that you have a happy marriage half the time, no matter how you look at it, and that's more than most men can say.
Weren't you flying at all?
Not in the squadron at first. While the training department was trying to invent a B/N syllabus for us, I bummed rides at station ops in the co-pilot seats of R4Ds or SNBs, twin-engine transports. When we finally began B/N training, it was in the ass end of P-2V Neptune patrol planes, modified with AJ bomb sights. During boring 4-hour flights, the 6 of us took turns dropping 25-pound inert practice bombs from 10,000 feet on a radar reflector on the Salton Sea north of El Centro. Since there were more of us than there were ditching stations aboard P2Vs, one of us had to sit at the unauthorized navigator station for takeoffs and landings. One day, the avionics chief petty officer substituted for our regular instructor in order to get his monthly 4-hour flight time to qualify for flight pay. As we taxied out, he abruptly ordered me to get in your ditching station. When I tried to explain that there wasn't another ditching station and that we had been using the navigator's seat instead, the chief exploded. "Not when I'm here. Get in your ditching station." I stayed put. I'd had all the fun I could stand. There was no further exchange on the subject until after we landed, and I called the chief aside to tell him what I thought of his disrespectful manner. He demanded to know what he said, and I quoted him with the same tone he had used. "That's what I said, and just the way I said it. If you don't like it, tell it to the ops officer." And he walked away. Well, my first leadership challenge. I did better than the ops officer, though. I went to the commanding officer with the result that the chief was permanently removed from flight pay status. Imagine the chief's added chagrin, Mike, when it turned out that as the assistant maintenance officer, I was his boss's boss. Having been raised by an Army sergeant, I knew how to regularly get in that bastard's face in his office and in front of his men. In 3 months, he threw in the towel and retired. That was the first time anyone had ever pissed me off to the point of getting revenge. Quite a satisfying new experience. It set a line of self-respect that no one was going to cross again without vengeful consequences to them. Thank you, Father.
Good for you, Captain. Too many people would have let it slide and have it eat away at them ever after. Anyhow, what did the 6 of you do besides drop practice bombs and bitch about it?
We translated stereo photographs of targets into radar predictions by viewing them with stereoscopic magnifying glasses. 2-scale pencil drawings, the size of the radar scope, depicting predicted radar returns, were made for each 5-mile increment of the inbound track for what the B/N hoped to see on his radar during the run-in, heading a laborious, tedious, and boring task. Using those radar predictions, we then made our early AJ flights on very high-altitude practice simulated bombing runs on the Air Force's radar bomb scoring site in downtown Los Angeles, with the designated Ground Zero being the southwest corner of the Sears Roebuck building. Unless you've done it, there is no way to describe the difficulty of the BN's task to consistently find a particular building on radar in a city the size of Los Angeles, especially with no intrinsic motivation for the job. Another tediously boring job for BNs was celestial navigation, using a periscope sextant to shoot and plot star sites for position fixes on long overwater night flights. For 2 of us, staring for hours at aerial photos of Los Angeles, drawing pictures of radar scopes, and spending hours at navigation plotting boards was too much. This was not what we extended for. BN assignment in heavy attack with no pilot flying opportunity was entirely unrelated and inappropriate to naval aviators training, and it certainly would have a negative impact on future promotions and assignments for those of us who remained on active duty. Since military flying is entirely voluntary hazardous duty, and no one can be ordered to it, Mark and John took their only remaining protest option. They turned in their wings and quit flying. As punishment, They were immediately transferred to destroyers. We never heard of them again, but I expect that their punishment was suffered most by the crews on those ships who served under them. The whole affair was an incredibly stupid waste of time, dollars, and manpower by the Navy.
What next for the four of you then, Captain?
We attended SWOPAC Special Weapons Unit Pacific for 3 weeks of highly intensive academic and hands-on instruction on the 2 actual nuclear bomb types carried by AJs. Incidentally, since an FBI special personal background investigation was required for a top-secret security clearance to attend SWOPAC, the question of my bigamy allegations were resurrected, probably during an interview with Emma. You'll recall that to explain Aurelie obvious pregnancy, I told the minister who married us that we had been married previously and just needed a later date to satisfy Navy regs. Unable to find evidence of bigamy, an agent finally asked me to sign a formal statement under oath declaring my innocence. I had good reason to suspect Emma because she was writing irrational letters to my CO, complaining of my negligence. After several of these letters, the admin officer finally just gave them to me to draft responses for his signature.
How long did that go on?
About once a month for more than a year. Emma was also writing newsy letters to me with pictures of herself and you, as though we were still married and I was away on cruise. If Emma's motive was to upset Aurelie, it worked, but not to your benefit. There was no way I could ever agree to seeing or corresponding with you as long as your mother and Aurelie were in the picture.
That pretty much goes along with my mother's portrayal of you to me as a youngster. She did date other men, but none of those relationships lasted long. I believe she scared men away because she was so strongly independent and eccentric. But I am certain that if she wanted to remarry, she would have made it happen. In any event, she was a devoted mother to me. Well, Captain, what say we get back to a more pleasant topic? How was it for you to get up close and personal with atomic bombs at SWOPAC?
I was most impressed by their simplicity. Basically, a nuclear reaction is nothing more than putting 2 subcritical parts together to form a single supercritical reaction. H-bombs use the heat and pressure of a nuclear reaction to initiate a secondary hydrogen reaction. The difficulty with building one of these monsters comes in processing the raw materials, but of course there were many other technical refinements developed in improving the efficiency of reactions. The smaller and older of the 2 weapons we carried was quite a Rube Goldberg affair. Because each of the 2 subcritical parts were so close to being dangerously supercritical, we had to assemble the bomb in the air, miles from the carrier and at altitude. The Rube Goldberg part was in the airborne assembly. The BN and 3rd crewmen went into the bomb bay with the core, which we launched with in the cockpit. The bomb, with its own battery, had 2 doors in the nose which opened with a push of a button. Then a track extended down in front and a small trolley car ran out onto which the core was placed. When another button was pushed, the trolley retracted into the spherical pit in the belly of the bomb. The track folded up and the doors closed. If the bomb battery was dead, we had a beautiful little box of shiny wrenches to accomplish the task manually. Then all that was left for us to do was set the 2 barometric fuses for the airburst altitude and deliver the damn thing to the target.
Amazing. What about the larger bomb?
The other was a very much more powerful and sophisticated multi-megaton hydrogen bomb. Even when nuclear bombs were so reduced in size and weight, that they could be delivered by single-engine light attack planes. The yield of our H-bomb was more powerful than the total of all the other bombs the air wing could deliver. I'll have more to say later about launching with a real one.
It seems the AJ and the heavy attack mission was a pretty big deal in keeping Navy carriers in the big picture during the operational introduction of nuclear weapons.
Oh, yes, indeed. Though I had little appreciation for my situation at the time. Remember, these were the days of the Cold War, when the U.S. was facing an imminent all-out nuclear exchange with the USSR. Conventional weapons were no longer an option. Every American citizen, man, woman, and child, understood the meaning of the terms mutually assured destruction and nuclear holocaust. Our homeland would not be spared annihilation in World War III. Fallout shelters were installed in the basements of many homes. School children were drilled in taking cover. Signs were posted in public places with shelter locations and instructions. One Sign of the Times advised folks to curl up in the fetal position with their head between their knees and kiss their ass goodbye.
Was it really that serious?
Worse. On top of everything else, there was the Korean War, the Berlin airlift, and finally the Cuban Missile Crisis, all of which nearly escalated into nuclear attacks. Most Americans believed that a nuclear war with the USSR was inevitable.
So the Navy response to the threat was the AJ? How did it come about?
In the opening paragraph of Steve Ginter's book, North American AJ-1 Savage, he writes, "The North American AJ Savage came into being as the direct result of the greatest Navy and government controversy since Billy Mitchell and the battleships. This controversy was over the future strike capability of the Navy, if any. At the end of World War II, the Army Air Corps, which became the Air Force in 1947, had total control over all nuclear weapons, and their B-29s were the only airplanes that could deliver them due to the bomb's size and weight. The Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs each weighed over 10,000 pounds. The Nagasaki Fat Man type bomb measured nearly 6 feet in diameter. Navy argued that the B-29 lacked long enough range, requiring launches from foreign bases to reach Soviet targets. However, there weren't many countries where the U.S. was permitted or willing to store nuclear weapons. Navy argued that Air Force's follow-on B-36 and B-52 long-range, high-altitude strategic bombers were vulnerable to early detection and attack, so would require fighter escort from foreign bases. The Navy's proposal was that it could launch strikes from carriers free to sail over 2/3 of the Earth's surface without foreign bases or flyover agreements. Consequently, Navy was allocated a grand total of 3 weapons and opened bomber design competition in August 1945, awarded to North American Aviation for a fast, medium-range, carrier-based bomber capable of delivering a Fat Man. Meanwhile, Navy needed an interim carrier-based nuclear delivery airplane. The only choice was the P-2V Neptune land-based patrol bomber, which was too large for normal carrier operations. Nevertheless, the Navy ordered 12 specially modified Neptunes, which were to be hoisted aboard carrier flight decks in port, deck-launched with rocket assist motors, and the crew recovered after ditching alongside rescue ships if they returned.
If, Captain? Were survival odds that grim?
Yes, grim for everyone. Our role was retaliation since politics did not allow for a preemptive attack. The Russians had the first strike surprise advantage. We'd be coming from behind at the outset, a bad position to be in for a nuclear exchange, which might not last past round one, because there would be little capability for follow-on strikes. Some scientists predicted that a radiation dust cloud would enshroud the planet and snuff out all life on the Earth's surface. So bomber crew survival was mostly a cosmetic consideration.
Were P2Vs ever deployed operationally aboard carriers?
No, but contingency plans for it were in place. To publicize the capability, however, a P2V with a dummy nuke aboard was deck-launched from an offshore Atlantic coast carrier and flown on a round-trip, non-stop flight to the Pacific coast, returning to an East Coast Naval Air Station. How did the AJ introduction pan out? Quite well. The AJ-1 was ordered in June 1946. The first 3 prototypes flew in June 1948, and squadron deliveries of 55 production AJ-1s began in September 1949. The improved model AJ-2s came along in February 1953. The Savage was the first naval combat aircraft to carry a nuclear weapon and the world's largest carrier-based aircraft. All carriers deployed with 4-plane AJ detachments. Because AJs were usually in launch alert status and folding at 75-foot wingspan was a 4-hour manual operation rarely done, AJs were a significant deck handling headache for aircraft handlers aboard small World War II vintage carriers, where they were always referred to as goddamn AJs. But as far as we were concerned, AJs were just damned bombers we had to ride shotgun in. We believed that there were only 2 types of aircraft, fighters and targets.
How did you hold up through all this?
I guess my Army upbringing and gratitude to be a naval aviator helped me to keep my head down and my mouth shut. I resolved to try to make the most of a bad situation which I had no control of. If 1,200 flight hours was required to get in the AJ left seat, I was going to get it in record time. I volunteered for every flight with an available seat, days, nights, weekends, cross countries, test flights, anything. Even so, however, it was going to take at least 3 years to get out of the right seat, and by then I would be out of the squadron. They threw us a bone by deciding that we could log BN flight time as co-pilot, but without ever being at the controls, that was a total farce. We would have no opportunity whatever to maintain flying proficiency, so it was unlikely that I would ever fly as a Navy pilot.
I know it didn't happen that way, Captain. What did?
I made friends with Bob Scully, the squadron landing signal officer, who was looking for 2 trainees. So another classmate, Hank James, and I volunteered. It was a good move. It was an outdoor job, away from the squadron, and got me out of the maintenance department assignment. Plus, controlling field carrier landing practice with paddles or radio was something like flying model airplanes. But the huge surprise benefit came with our next change of command. Our new CO was Commander Burley Grimes, a cigar-chewing General LeMay-type fighter pilot whose favorite expression was horseshit. When he discovered that he had 2 LSOs who weren't flying the AJ, he said, horseshit, got a waiver of the 1,200-hour flight time requirement, and put both of us in the left seat to be trained as heavy attack aircraft commanders. Glory, hallelujah. Thank God. 3 months later, Hank and I were on our way to the Western Pacific aboard the carrier Hornet, as the first and only First Tour junior officers ever to deploy as designated heavy attack aircraft commanders.
Quite an incredibly favorable turn of events, Captain. What was it like to fly the AJ? Was it disappointing after flying jets?
Are you kidding? Hank and I had just jumped from the worst flying job in the Navy to the most prestigious. How could we possibly be disappointed? AJs were unique in aviation history and a joy to fly. Sure, they were bombers, but with two props and a jet, sometimes referred to as two screws and a blowjob, they were capable of speeds over 400 knots and could even be flown on the Javelin at light weights. The controls were hydraulically boosted, and there was a respectable 5G maneuvering limit, which even made AJs competitive in dogfights. Best of all, we flew off carriers, even at night, when it was so challenging that the only other night flyers were the all-weather fighters. Even by twin-engine bomber standards, AJs were big airplanes, in part because the fuselage size was determined by the Fat Man bomb. It was a powerful experience for me to walk up to one sitting silently on the flight line and then climb aboard to breathe life into it as though I were Dr. Frankenstein. It lives! It lives! I never felt anything like that about any of the other 20-plus type airplanes I flew.
So it was all smooth sailing? No screw-ups?
Now that you mention it, Mike, 4 small incidents do come to mind. Hank was riding shotgun with me one day when we had to make a sharp left turn, taxiing out of the Chalks. There was an AJ up on jacks off the ground, undergoing maintenance with its tail sticking out of the hangar in front of us. My attention was focused on signals by the taxi director for the turn when I felt us hit something as the taxi director frantically gave the crossed wands stop signal. We stopped with our right wingtip fuel tank under the hangared AJ's tail, dangerously close to lifting it off the jacks. Fortunately, the AJ did not fall off the jacks, and there was only minor cosmetic damage. We were able to make the flight, but I knew that Skipper Grimes wouldn't miss the chance to embarrass me at the next all-pilots meeting. So I skipped it, and Hank had to take the ribbing. Since he was acting as my co-pilot in the right seat, it was his responsibility to be sure our right wing was clear. Plus, there should have been a wing walker lineman at that wingtip.
What about the taxi signalman's responsibility?
I don't know what was said to him, but I'm sure he felt as embarrassed as I did. I probably should have discussed it with him and Hank after the flight to ease our mutual pain, but it was more my style to let such sleeping dogs lie. The less said about it, the better. The second incident I recall occurred off Hawaii. We were operating there for the Hornet and Air Wing Operational Readiness Inspection, ORI, by CIN CPA CFLT, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet. In the rush to deploy us on this cruise, there hadn't been time for Hank and me to fill one small block for our HAAC designations, 4-night arrested carrier qualification landings, our first ever. So one night in Hornet's flight schedule was set aside just for our command performance, our one and only chance before sailing on to the Western Pacific. Now, Mike, 4 arrested landings in one night is a formidable challenge. Lots of things can go wrong. Bad weather and ship or aircraft malfunctions, not to mention considerable pilot stress and strain. Flying low in an inky black hole on the ocean, visually orienting on finding the ship and lining up on center line and the optical glide slope with no visual horizon reference or depth perception, while also keeping track of the cockpit instruments for altitude, airspeed, power setting, and attitude, combined to make night carrier landings the most difficult routine operational task performed in airplanes. Throw in some rain, a pitching deck in high seas, low fuel state, an electrical failure, a rough running engine, or food poisoning, and there's nothing routine about it. On Hornet vintage carriers, there was only 10 feet between the airplane and the aft blunt ends of the ship, often referred to as the spud locker or the ramp. 1.5 degrees of deck pitch reduced that clearance to 0. Add rolling and heaving, the vertical movement of the entire ship crossing waves, and it becomes extremely demanding white-knuckle flying.
How were your firsts memorable?
It was January 23rd, 1958. My total flight time was 592 hours, but only 165 hours as first pilot. I had begun flying left seat in October, made 17-day arrested landings in November, 5 more in January, including 2 landings earlier that day on Hornet. That night was fairly clear and calm, but impressively dark. Since there was no reason for my BN, Jack Lancio, to be aboard, I launched with my third crewman in the right seat. I'm sorry I can't recall his name, but he was very young, pleasant, and fearless. It was good not to have 3 nervous people aboard. I didn't catch up with flying the airplane on the first approach. I felt like I wasn't in charge of the event. I wondered why in the hell I was doing this, or if I could. I wanted to stop the airplane and get off. Although the approach itself wasn't out of limits, the LSO either sensed my uneasiness or his own, and I was waved off. My second approach was a wave off as well, but this time it was more the LSO's uneasiness than mine. On my third approach, just as I was turning onto final heading, with no warning whatever, my starboard engine suddenly and without warning quit cold. Of course, it took a second or two to comprehend what was actually happening. In twin-engine aircraft, it is important to be certain which engine has failed before taking corrective action, which might shut down the wrong one. A great truth is, never turn into the dead engine. Fortunately, I was in a left turn, away from the dead engine. Another great truth is, in an emergency, the most important thing is to maintain safe flight. So the task at hand was to scan the engine instruments for clues, while also flying the airplane on one engine at 500 feet on approach for my first night carrier landing.
It makes my hands sweaty to hear it, Captain. What did you do?
Well, before I could do much of anything, all by itself the engine started again, smooth as silk, just as before. So I continued the approach to a reasonably good landing. I guess the engine took my mind off worrying about the landing. As I taxied out of the landing area, the air boss said on the radio, "Congratulations." I thought he meant for finally getting aboard. You just made the 49,000th arrested landing aboard Hornet.
What a way to finish off the night.
Finish? I wasn't finished. I needed 3 more landings to be qualified, and this was the last night to do it. Bad engine or not, I was going to press on if the engine ran up okay before the next catapult launch. I also started the jet engine for backup and went on for 3 more arrested landings with my very brave third crewman in the right seat and no further engine problems. Subsequent investigation revealed a crack across the top of one of 18 cylinders between intake and exhaust valves, requiring an engine change. Did I mention that I was the detachment safety officer?
No, you didn't. But you obviously were not a very good one, were you?
Like my granny always said, you can't argue with success. However, I did give a stern speech in our ready room, warning everyone not to compromise safety for the sake of a readiness inspection. I had no idea how badly I was going to eat those words 2 days later during the NOREX.
Do as you say, not as you do, Captain. What is a NOREX?
Nuclear Ordnance Readiness Exercise to test the carrier's ability to handle actual war reserve nuclear weapons in a precisely timed sequence as part of SIOP.
Lord, how do you keep track of all those acronyms? What's a SIOP?
Single Integrated Operational Plan, which was the schedule for all nuclear strikes, including Air Force and Navy bombers, as well as intercontinental ballistic missiles. Some targets were considered so strategically important they were designated for multiple weapons, so we might arrive on target to find a smoking hole. Also, it was possible that a bomber's track could take it into a fireball. SIOP was an attempt to coordinate the timing of strikes, thus the importance of adhering to the launch schedule timing in a NOREX.
Interesting, Captain. How is it you knew so much about the targets?
Each of our assigned targets were laboriously planned during the weeks before deploying on cruise, using every available piece of intelligence. As BNs did with the Los Angeles RBS site photos, they again made pencil radar predictions from actual target stereo photos. Crew's highly detailed flight plans were then closely reviewed by the CO, Air Wing Commander, and sometimes by the carrier's CO.
What can you say about the nature of the targets?
Priority was assigned to destroying the enemy's offensive capability for a second strike, so they were military targets, places like airfields, not people. Typically, our targets were long-range bomber bases in remote locations, not population centers or industrial sites.
Were all your targets in the Soviet Union?
No, and that's all I can say about targets, except to note that one of mine was such a great distance that we had to land for refueling to reach it.
There couldn't have been much chance of getting there on that one, much less getting back.
Perhaps, however, we devoted a good deal of effort to planning how we would succeed alive. We were not in some goofy Jap kamikaze frame of mind, I assure you. Nevertheless, our best hope of survival was to be so convincing to the Russians of our capability and determination to wipe them off the map too, that they would be rational enough to decide against launching an attack. That's what mutually assured destruction, MAD, and deterrence were all about. And it worked.
But we couldn't use that rationale so well against insane Muslim terrorist acts without identifiable nationalities, could we?
Not to the degree we did against the USSR, but we convinced Arab nations that they would be held responsible and attacked with dire consequences to their political security if we were nuked by terrorists harbored by them. Muslim or not, all people are motivated to survive at some subterranean level, aren't they? God, I truly hope so, but there's much evidence to the contrary when it comes to Muslims. Perhaps, but that is not nearly as politically viable nor militarily possible as it was in the Cold War. Invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, for example, were only partial successes. Nevertheless, those actions sent strong messages to Saudi Arabia and the others that there could be major consequences to them for supporting terrorism. Some say Korea and Vietnam were not successful. However, they were only limited battles in the Cold War, which we won. Our determination in those conflicts was backed up with do not cross lines defending against forceful communist expansion. They were effective military deterrents in the big picture, which bought us time to succeed on the political and economic fronts. Truman had the guts to take sole responsibility for dropping the bomb on the Japs. So, bad cop Nixon credibly frightened Russia, China, and Vietnam into believing he was crazy enough to launch preemptive strikes against them, and that good cop Kissinger was the only one keeping him from doing it. Nixon had the strength to launch B-52s against Hanoi and force the North to talk peace. Reagan's brilliance was leading the U.S. into outspending the USSR into economic and political oblivion to win the Cold War. Carter and Clinton should have been impeached for their damage to our credibility. Johnson was rightly run out of office for his irresponsible leadership failures in the Vietnam conflict. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. Where were we?
You had recalled 2 of 3 AJ incidents you wished to relate, and you were telling about the Norex.
Aha, yes, good for you remembering a Navy acronym. My mission was to fly off a War Reserve H-bomb to be downloaded at Barbers Point Naval Air Station. The real thing, Mike, 3.5 megatons. Fuse disarmed, of course, but capable of a low-order detonation in a crash or fire. Because of the size of the bomb and the low fuselage, AJs had to be parked directly over the dedicated special weapons elevator, straight up into the bomb bay. I was greatly impressed that the AJ was engineered to take the load of a 10,000-pound bomb on a single suspension point throughout a hydraulic catapult shot. Unlike the follow-on steam catapults with steady acceleration down the track, hydraulic cats were more like a cannon shot, with most of the acceleration at the beginning. It was quite a jolt and one hell of a load to put on a bomb suspended by a single lug to launch a 52,000-pound airplane up to flying speed in a 2-second run down a 150-foot track. But back to my story. The bomb elevator was located so the AJ was also in position on the number 2 catapult, directly in front of the captain's bridge, wings spread, ready to launch without taxiing forward. The only other airplanes aboard capable of carrying much smaller weapons on this launch were the single-engine AD Sky Raiders, which were spotted aft on the flight deck for deck launch on their own steam. However, since the AJ's port wing hung out across the flight deck too far to allow the ADs to deck launch, we had to go first. If I didn't get off, no one would, and the Norks would be a complete failure.
I smell one coming, Captain.
Yes, indeed, Mike. Everything was routine through the load. But interesting to note that though we were aboard a carrier at sea, there was an apron around the bomb bay to obscure the weapon from view, for even its size and shape was top secret, and the area was guarded by a half-dozen Marines with automatic weapons. Jack, my BN, and I went through the bomb's lengthy checklist with the weapons officer and an inspection observer. Although I had been hands-on with the cutaway training weapon, touching the real thing in the bomb bay of an airplane I was going to fly, having also been through the target planning process, brought the whole business home to me. Although I was much too busy and focused on the task at hand to ponder the experience, I was acutely aware of the reality of my job. This was no longer just a training exercise. This was as close to the real main event as we could get without going all the way. Actually, Mike, like so many complex events which sped by in rapid succession, there never was time allowed for deep introspection, nor anyone interested in hearing it. When I have recalled stories, they were abbreviated, out of context, and impersonal, seeming to be things that happened to someone else, or like a movie I once saw. The greatest benefit now in telling you these stories is for me to consciously relive them in sequence and put them in some kind of perspective. Until now, it never really struck me how much complete trust my country had put in me at a very inexperienced and tender age. But I digress too much. When I got to the magneto check on the port engine, the RPM drop was out of limits, so I gave the thumbs down signal to the catapult officer. So much for the Norex. The first tour Lieutenant JG in the AJ was blowing the whole thing. Without shutting down, I set the parking brake, and Jack went back into the bomb bay to replace the bomb safety pins. A mechanic came into the cockpit to help troubleshoot the engine, but it only got worse. After about 10 minutes of this fruitless exercise and answering constant radio inquiries from the air boss, damned if my boss, Lieutenant Commander Marv Cooper, the detachment officer in charge, didn't show up on the flight deck and signaled me with a thumbs up and launch signal to go anyhow. So, after we got the mechanic out and Jack back in after removing the safety pins again, I shoved the throttles up, saluted the catapult officer, and down the deck we went, with the parking brake still set, digging 4 grooves in the teak flight deck and a rooster tail of splinters behind us.
Oh my God, how awful. What happened?
You say, "Oh my God." Imagine yourself as Hornet's skipper, Captain Tom Connolly, with ambitions to be the Chief of Naval Operations. There from his bridge, before him a first-tour junior officer was going down the flight deck in an AJ with a bad engine and an H-bomb aboard with the brakes locked, falling out of sight off the bow, heading for the Pacific Ocean, likely to be cut apart by Hornet's bow and perhaps sucked into the giant screws, setting off a low-order nuclear explosion under his fantail.
Gives new meaning to one's career going up in smoke, doesn't it, Captain? But I take it that did not happen. What did?
Well, the catapult paid no attention to the locked brakes, and we fired off with plenty of flying speed. However, with the nose gear off the bow before the main landing gear, the effect of the locked brakes was to pitch the AJ's nose down enough for us to drop out of sight from the flight deck. So I took the only action open to me. I pulled the yoke back to get the nose up and climbed out heading for Hawaii. It was all over so fast that I had no emotional reaction. The only radio transmission to me was an unnecessary reminder to release my parking brakes before landing.
What were the consequences for you?
Fortunately, we spent 2 days at Barber's Point before rejoining Hornet in port, so there was some breathing space for reflection by all. Obviously, I was embarrassed about the parking brakes, but there was no harm done by it. The worst was having held up the launch, plus the public humiliation of being told by my boss to go anyhow. It made me feel stupid and timid, even though 7 bad spark plug leads were later found on that engine. I should have refused to launch. It had been a foolish risk. Nothing was said directly to me about the incident. However, a few weeks later, Captain Connolly reviewed one of my targets with me on the bridge, and the son of a bitch lectured me about the courage needed to fly such missions. As it happened, we rarely flew because Connolly didn't want to risk accidents on his watch. "We're just out here in case something starts," he said. I had only 23 flights, and only 2 at night, during the remainder of the 6-month cruise to Westpac. Connolly, deservedly, came to be called Captain Tuna, Chicken of the Sea. Nevertheless, He later succeeded in becoming the Chief of Naval Operations.
Quite an entrance you made there on Hornet, wasn't it? Reminds me of what you said before about the pukin dogs. If you can't be good, be colourful.
Yeah, and what Ron Hess advised, don't ever just fade into the woodwork. Let them know you were there. That's life. Live and learn. There's a great truth for everything, isn't there?
Yes, indeed. That's how they become cliches. So, did the rest of your AJ flying on that cruise go without incident?
Almost, but not quite. Because AJs were so large and difficult to handle on the flight deck, we were always last to land on a recovery. The only parking area large for us was behind the island structure on the starboard side of the flight deck. So the routine was to shut down AJs in place after landing, hook up a tug on the nose gear, and push us back into the parking spot as the ship turned out of the wind. One day as we were doing this, the officer of the deck got too frisky with the starboard right turn out of the wind, and Hornet heeled sharply to port at a 10 to 15 degree angle. It was more than the tug cold handle, and we were sliding rapidly toward the port side. When the tug's brakes proved ineffective, the driver jumped off and ran up the deck and left me to try to stop both the AJ and the tug, rapidly accelerating toward the edge of the flight deck for a 60-foot drop into the Pacific. With the AJ's engine shut down, so were the hydraulic pumps which supplied brake pressure to the main landing gear. So my instinctive application of rudder pedal brakes was useless. Fortunately, the Norex incident familiarized me with the AJ parking brake system, which was operated by an air bottle independent of the hydraulic system. We so rarely used it, it was easy to forget they were there. By the time I reached down to pull the brake handle, we were rolling so fast and so close to the deck edge, I believe another second or two delay would have been too late.
What fallout from that incident was there?
Nothing. Not a word was said to me about it, though I'm sure the officer of the deck probably got an earful from Captain Connolly. Hornet's turns out of the wind were much more tame thereafter.
Didn't it seem strange to you that there wasn't much more said to you about those 4 AJ incidents?
Yes, it did, Mike. I expected lots of hindsight chiding, as my critical Army father would have done. However, it was a consistent experience throughout my Navy career that, as long as no harm was done, we were given credit for being smart enough to learn through introspection. Silence can be a very effective leadership technique for developing young executives, especially applicable to the Navy, where subs, ships, and aircraft operate far from direct supervision and where quick independent thinking is required by COs. One of the aspects I enjoyed most about being in the Navy was the fact that we were given this latitude to do things our own way as long as desired results were achieved. At the same time, we very well understood that a single serious error could be career terminating. I doubt that there is any other organization, military or civilian, where this is so uniquely true. In that sense, at least, we were like sole proprietors. It was up to us to learn to sink or swim on our own, and that thinking extends to the lowest-ranking seamen. We were literally on the same ship together, and any one of us could sink it if we didn't pay attention.
With so much technology and ships scattered across the Earth's oceans, I can see where the Navy has to operate with a looser chain of command than the other services. I found out the hard way about the downside of self-reliance as a sole proprietor of a law firm, as opposed to being a state office employee subject to comparatively close supervision, rigid regulation, and constant scrutiny. Navy life sounds like the best of both worlds, except at the great price of family separation, with years at sea away from civilization.
True, Mike, nothing's ever easy or perfect. The choice is a matter of one's priorities. Perhaps this is a good place to stop. We can pick up with the Hornet cruise when we get back from the airport this evening. Okay?
Okay, Captain, let's go.